first you have to understand that we have dominated the planet with our financial system, certainly since the end of the Second World War. And as a result, we want to ensure that Russia and China and India and other countries are assimilated into the financial system that we control. That's part of the reason for our opposition to Russia and China. These efforts have failed. In fact, right now it looks as though 3.75 billion people on the planet will stop using the dollar to do business. That's the response to this Ukraine war. In other words, the very opposite of what we hoped to accomplish. Again, we were trying to drive people into submission. The people are not submitting. They're finding a way around us. We're going to end up dealing in the future with 3.75 billion people who will operate with currencies that are pegged to gold. That's what's shaping up in Russia and China and India. We, on the other hand, are going to be outside of that with our system. Whether or not it will still be dollar dominated or some other means will come into existence, I don't know. But that's a big factor here. Secondly, everyone in Washington is short-term in their thinking. No one thinks much beyond the next election. No one thinks much beyond whatever is important to them today. There is no one who sits there and says, where do we as Americans want to be financially, economically, militarily in 10 years? Everything's about spend now for X, Y, or Z. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, he was the former ambassador to China and Saudi Arabia, has said repeatedly that every 4 years we tend to lobotomize Washington. And I think that's true. We give everybody a lobotomy. Whatever happened under the previous president is no longer of interest. We're going to build the brave new world with the new administration. So there is no long-term strategic thinking at all. Now, this was not an issue for us before the First World War, because frankly, the government in Washington, I don't want to say it was irrelevant, but it was certainly not the centerpiece of American national, industrial, and economic development. Most of the development was from the ground up. And that even persisted after the First World War for a while. And when the government did become involved, it was not always bad. There were good things that were done, but they were on the margins, tinkering on the margins of a larger scientific industrial expansion that began right after the Civil War. And it was not driven by the government per se. Well, those days are over. We don't live in that kind of world anymore. We have to have borders that are real. We cannot allow millions of people to migrate into the country whom we did not invite, whom we can't afford to support, and who may have hostile intentions toward us. That's just insane. It's worse than suicidal. That's a huge problem. All you have to do is take a look at your large cities to see what happens when you don't enforce the law, when you don't actively fight criminality. And then finally, there's the armed forces. Our armed forces are not in good shape. They're in terrible shape. I used to cringe when I listened to President Trump, and he would say, we have the greatest armed forces in the world. Well, look, Mr. President, I know that you love our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and you're very proud of the armed forces, but I wish we'd scale back this talk, because we are not what we were 30 years ago. In Washington, people don't seem to understand that the military power that they saw wielded successfully in 1991 no longer exists. You're talking about a time when there were thousands of aircraft from the Air Force and the Navy. You're talking about a time when the Army was still over 800,000 strong, and then was subsequently dramatically reduced down to 495,000. I watched as 163,000 combat veterans left the service because there was no room for them anymore, and they willingly left with bonuses for their great work. Well, that's fine, but what were we left with? We were left with a smaller version of an old force. And that's what you've got everywhere right now. Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines. Now you add to that the social engineering problems that have gotten way out of control. They were always there, They were always a problem, but today they are fatal in their impact. And this administration is delighted with it. Doesn't seem to understand that on the one hand, you want to wage war against anybody who doesn't agree with you and will not submit to our financial domination. On the other hand, the means with which you once had the ability to enforce have vanished. Those means are just not what they were 30 years ago. And I don't know what we can do to get the American people to understand that simply throwing money at defense is not an answer. We don't even know where the money goes. We can't audit the Department of Defense. And we know that we're wasting huge quantities of it. And in the meantime, lots of people on the Hill, lots of people in the private sector, people in certain districts and states are growing wealthy as a result. The problem is we're not improving our defense posture. So we're witnessing a much larger problem than just what's happening in Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is being destroyed, but the American people are not getting the rest of the picture. Our potential opponent, if you want to call the Russians that, is far stronger now than it has been in decades. Its armed forces are modern. Its capabilities are impressive. And we don't want to go to war with these people. There's no reason for us to go to war. We don't have any reason to go to war with China. If you want to stop the Chinese from stealing your intellectual property, throw them out of our corporate laboratories, get them out of our universities. If you want to stop the fentanyl from pouring into the United States, don't bomb China, close the border. Put the 40 or 50,000 troops that we've got in Poland on the border with Mexico. Stop it. Then go after the people inside the United States who are supporting these networks of drug dissemination and distribution. Go after them. Restore the rule of law in our major cities. Don't bomb Mexico, because if you bomb Mexico, if you go after the drug cartels in Mexico right now, your borders are wide open. The criminality in the United States is unchecked. We'll end up with a war inside the United States that's worse than the war in Mexico. So these are just stupid, uninformed commentary. Again,
I've always wondered, would the cartels employ Al-Qaeda style terroristic attacks in America if they wanted to, blowing
Yes, that's exactly right. You're absolutely 100% right. They're much better armed than the National Guard.
Yeah.
They're much better armed than our Border Patrol. The Border Patrol will tell you that. They would love to see the Army back on the border. We were there for 100 years. The United States Army maintained forces on that border for 100 years. Eisenhower, Patton, MacArthur, everybody served on the Mexican border. People just don't understand this is not a new problem. It was because Mexico has always had difficulties controlling its own problems with internal criminality. And we had to stop it from spilling into the United States. Well, now we've opened the floodgates. And it's not just Mexico. It's coming up to us all the way from Venezuela and Colombia and through Central America and from Cuba. And nobody seems to want to address these realities. But you don't just start bombing people, because you say, well, we've got to punish the drug cartels. The Mexican government is an organized crime state. They're not going to help you. The Mexican army is part of the cartel system. Why wouldn't they be? The cartels have all the money. Anybody who wants to survive in Mexico is on somebody's payroll. The government can't compete with that.
Why does the Mexican leftist president say positive things about Trump, saying he shouldn't have been banned off of social media? What was in it for him to say that if he's part of the crime cartel?
Who knows? Who knows? I wouldn't pay any attention to anything that comes out of the Mexican government. That thing is a disaster. It can't control its own country because it itself is under control of the drug cartels.
I wonder what drug cartels have relationships with our own government, though.
Well, we know that the police organizations in the United States, all the way up to and including Washington, are in fact infiltrated by the drug cartels.
So how could we ever even possibly, realistically, in our current corrupt system, how could we even properly wage a drug war when so much of the systemic corruption from local police to like you said, federal agencies having corruption within their structures from the top down,
Well, you just answered the question why the so-called drug war begun many, many years ago in the Clinton years, in earnest, had no impact. It was just a facade. You're absolutely right. But can these things be stopped? Can we turn these things around? Yes, I think they can be done. But you're talking about very harsh measures that have to be taken. And you're talking about using police power and military power to regain control of our streets, our neighborhoods. I mean, who would have thought 30 years ago that a beautiful city like San Francisco would turn into what it's become? Incomprehensible. I grew up in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was bad in the 60s and the 70s. It's much worse now. Everything that was once a problem has metastasized into a serious cancer. Either we deal with it or ultimately we go under. And I don't think Americans really want to come to terms with that yet. They know it in many cases, but there are many Americans that sit in places where things seem to be quite good, and they say, "Well, I'm comfortable here in eastern Kansas. I'm doing fine in Montana. Things aren't bad in Maine, where I live, or western Connecticut. So what's your problem?" We have a very large country. The problems are not uniform, but when you look at the large cities and you look at the concentrations of people who are dying from fentanyl, put that picture together, and suddenly you realize you've got to do something much, much more stringent, much more intrusive than what we've been doing. But instead of focusing on these things, we have an attorney general that talks about white supremacy as being the leading cause of every ill in the world and every ill in America. Insane. This, how do you deal with that kind of ideological blindness? I don't know the answer, but I do know that if we don't take action, this country may not make it.
Yeah.
And it's not going to go under because of our spending on Ukraine. That doesn't help us. That just exacerbates the problem. But just remember, go back to something you said, David. When you look at the Congress, they are willing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on this fiasco in Ukraine. They're willing to spend money for an alleged defense of this island of Taiwan that may well vote itself into China, because they've got two parties on Taiwan. One's pro-Chinese, the other's pro-Japanese. The pro-Chinese party is probably going to come to power next. They may well vote to join China. We don't know what's really happening politically in Asia. But we'll spend all sorts of money on that. But look at the United States. 100,000 Americans die of fentanyl poisoning, and no one will close the border. No one will complete the barrier on the Mexican border. No one wants to commit military power to defend this country. We'll defend Ukraine and Poland, but we won't defend America. What's wrong with that?